I would like to talk about a project which we have been engaged in with Crimson for the last 2 years. Some of you might know it already. Oh, moet ik het in het Engels of in het Nederlands doen? Oh. It's called A City of Comings and Goings, and it deals with the effects of migration on our cities. I never realized how much this was in the line of the previous presentations, but I guess all for the better. This project we started 2 years ago at the height of the so-called refugee crisis, and we noticed how 20 years ago there was actually, well, it's probably the family of Erna, who was part of this wave of refugees in the 90s coming from Yugoslavia, and about 50,000 of Yugoslavians joined us in the Netherlands. At that time, there was not so much discussion about competition on the housing or the job market as there is now. There was not as much conflict as there is now. And of course, this has to do with the changed political landscape in our country and in Western Europe. But it also has to do with a number of spatial and architectural elements. And we felt that because of the relation of the topic with architecture and urban planning, we decided that this was an angle that we had to choose to deal with this topic too, om ons steentje bij te dragen, as it were. Presently you can see that this topic of competition on the housing market especially is not even only a topic for the newspapers, but you could argue that it's also actively being promoted and stimulated by some political parties. It has been mentioned before that populist parties actually prey on this development and use it for their purposes. What is new is that the discussion was focused on refugees only, we thought well, the question of course is, what is your position in this debate? We are architecture historians, and we found that our position would be that of zooming out and creating a different kind of narrative that wasn't purely focused on this problematic group, but that zoomed out in time and showed that migration is actually a sort of fundamental element of urban culture for the last centuries, probably for as long as mankind has existed, and also to zoom out in groups. So refugees are not the only kind of migrants that we have in our countries. Migrants is a very heterogeneous group that also consists of international students, of expats, well, you mentioned, there's a whole wide range of migrants that form part of this constant changing of our cities. And our cities have always been able to accommodate all these groups. So this zooming out, changing the narrative, that was one of the goals of this project, City of Comings and Goings, that we undertook. What is new is that groups like expats, for instance, that have until recently been considered as on the other pole of the group of migrants, namely those who are wealthy and cause no problem at all, that every country and every city want to attract, that has changed. All over Western Europe, now also expats and tourists are being seen as, well, almost as problematic as refugees are. If you look at Barcelona, you can see this sign saying, tourists, your luxury trip, my daily misery. And in Venice, of course, you have the same movement to safeguard the city for the inhabitants, save it against the tourists. And in Amsterdam, also the same sounds are beginning to pop up over the last year. And this is going very, very quickly, this development, and changing this whole perspective on the city of comings and goings and the temporary living in our cities. Well, Paris, London, Berlin, it's all the same. They are all dealing with the same issues of competition in the housing job market, with real estate issues, etc. So, and this is one of the big problems that I think should be on the agenda. that our cities, if you look at Western Europe, are becoming more and more the same in one very frightening and problematic aspect, which is that our inner cities, if you see Paris, Rome, Amsterdam, and Berlin, they are becoming more and more the same. There's tourist destinations, completely gentrified, musea, nice public space, shops, etc. The whole, sort of tourist luxury experience. While if you would go to the outskirts of exactly those same cities, then it would be completely the opposite. So no tourists, no good public space, no wealth, no jobs, no nothing. So there is a tendency in which our inner cities are becoming more the same, and also our banlieues, our buitenwijken, our suburbs are becoming increasingly the same. And this shows, and this is now happening in Amsterdam increasingly, but in Rotterdam it is starting to happen, that there is an increasing segregation, not only in migrants but also in income groups, in which the wealthy and the rich live in the inner cities, and the rest gets pushed out of the cities. And of course migrants are sort of part of this movement, in which you can see that this is exactly the same cities again, in which you can see that the outskirts are increasingly lived in by people with a background of migration. So I think there's a sense of urgency in this topic. And so we looked at different aspects of migration, housing, and here it touches upon a different scale, not that of segregation and a large urban scale, but of that of architecture. So how are these migrants that are coming into the country, how are they accommodated, how are they housed? Very often it's a temporary housing. So it is either in a sports hall or it is by container housing, which is beautified, but still it is temporary living. While you could say that if migration is a permanent feature of our cities, then also this architecture should be permanent and should be of the highest quality. Rick Bakker also mentioned it. What we do, we should do in the best way. It should be of high quality. And so we looked at the architecture of migration in Western Europe, rating it according to 3 criteria, and one of them being permanence. So the permanence of architecture for migration, the quality of this architecture is one element. The other one is emancipation, the ability of an environment to create possibilities for its inhabitants, to create emancipation on the social ladder. And the S stands for shared space, either within the building or outside of the building in public space. So permanence, shared space, and emancipation as the 3 criteria for improving the integration of incoming people in our cities. Now, and then we made a catalogue of 100 examples of either experiments or best practices, and maybe these two create the 2 poles of the spectrum. Architecture could work well in this aspect in 2 very different ways. Maybe this one is the most interesting. It's the public library Dokken in Aarhus, and it is a huge public building combining the city hall with a library, with cafes and canteens. And if you want to get a passport, you go there. If you want a book, you go there. If you want to have a coffee, you go there. So it combines a lot of groups and offers a platform for exchange in that sense. But it's also a sign in that it uses architecture to show that this is a public building and that it's proud of that. So architecture can be and can have a symbolic value, showing the common good that this building personifies. Well, a lot of other buildings, but I'm not going into that. It's just the conclusions that we put from this research on different levels actually has to do with architecture again. The first is maybe also the most important. So you should create large amounts of cheap space for living and working, notably social housing. What we have seen, especially in the Netherlands, is that the amount of social housing has hugely diminished since the 90s. And that is probably also one of the reasons why the Yugoslavian migration was not a problem, and now every migrant seems to be a problem. So social housing, high on the ladder, should be high on the ladder. It was one of the things that the Netherlands were always known for, and that we have a good tradition in, and that, well, also abroad we are known for, and now this is sort of diminishing, and that's really a shame. And then, so we made these other conclusions, make new icons for collective values, make robust and beautiful buildings, make it easy to share facilities and space, embed migrants in the community and economy, and don't house them on the Veluwe in the middle of nowhere, though it looked nice, the tourist village, and make space, rules, and program more adaptable. So, but then, of course, these conclusions, yes, we need probably the right friends to share these conclusions with, and to make sure that they are also moving forward. But we also made this program, City of Comings and Goings, migration in its widest meaning of the word, into the topic of the new institute that was mentioned before, the Independent School for the City, that we started with ZUS in Rotterdam, and that we just had the opening event. And it has to do, the subtitle is Research, Stories, Strategies, Actions. And it has to do with what is your position in this whole field that you want to have an influence on. Can stories and a new narrative really be influential? Like in this case of migration, can you change the whole narrative focusing on the problematic of refugees into a wider story on migration, which has its influences on all these other aspects of the city and has a lot more and a wider meaning? And I guess that is one of this is a school that we want to tackle really urgent issues for our cities with, and come up with this whole range of research, narratives, and finally also actions. And we want to do that in Rotterdam, because it's our home base, because Rotterdam has, if you look at the Netherlands, one of the most urgent urban agendas. And also we want to zoom out from Rotterdam to abroad and bring foreign knowledge, international knowledge back into the Netherlands and into Rotterdam, because that's also one of the things that we need, not only ambition, but also competence and knowledge. And we need more knowledge and less emotions. Thank you.